Welcome to the September episode of the Organic Gardening Podcast. I'm Hannah Rogers, and regular listeners will notice that mine is not the normal voice you hear. I work alongside Sarah, our usual presenter, at Garden Organic and have been handed the reins for 1 month only, while Sarah enjoys a well-earned break. This month, as usual, I'll be joined by my colleagues at Garden Organic, Chris Collins and Anton Rosenfeld. Chris and I talk about houseplants and the therapeutic benefit they can bring if you haven't got much outside space. We also reflect on the successes and the failures of the year so far, and Chris shares his advice for all the new growers to keep their interest in the garden going throughout the autumn and winter months. Later during our interview, Chris is joined by Garden Organic Ambassador Caroline Holmes. Caroline is a world-renowned garden historian and an expert on a really broad range of topics, ranging from Impressionism all the way through to dung. Finally, we look at some of the questions Garden Organic members have sent our way, discussing seed saving, bare soil and woodlice. As always, we're grateful to our sponsors, the Organic Gardening Catalogue. This is my go-to website when I need to buy anything for the garden, and also the odd Christmas present. Just visit organiccatalogue.com to browse their range, and if you're a member of Garden Organic, you receive a 10% discount on all orders. You won't be surprised to hear that we're still recording remotely, so I hope you can forgive the odd crackle and be kind on this rookie at the helm. Sarah will be back soon, I promise. So, Chris, September, it's often a month when things start to slow down. Is that the case for you?
Yeah, I think you're kind of nearing that crossroad, aren't you? Of you're still kind of ticking over the garden. There's still quite a lot going on, but your mind is starting to think about the big changes that are not so far away. You know, autumn will be soon. That's planting time, bulb time, put new crops in. There's loads going to go on around then. So you're kind of in that halfway house of still enjoying your allotment, still enjoying the balcony, but knowing that those changes are not far away.
It feels like maybe a sort of period of calm. You've still got a bit of good weather. You know, like you say, things are still looking nice. You've still got some crops coming. And it's just that opportunity to actually relax and enjoy what you've produced.
Yeah, it's not time to it's the quiet before the storm, a bit like the end of the winter. You know there's all this work coming up, but don't jump ahead. Enjoy what's going on still, because you've kind of worked hard for it to get to this point.
So what will you be doing down on your allotment this month? What are your priorities?
Well, I'm still cropping down there, but I'm looking at putting in stuff that I want to continue into the winter, really, that I can carry on growing. So I'm looking at broad beans. I'm looking at growing those. I'll start those in root trainers, and they'll go in ready to eat next year. And also, it's a good time to put those cooler crops. I'm going to still put rocket in. I'll put some onions in as well. I'll put in cut and come again salad, spinach. I've had trouble with those plants this year because it was so hot in spring. So I'm quite looking forward to keeping that sort of freshness growing, really. As for the balcony, I mean, the balcony's just been fantastic this year, and I will just carry on ticking it over. We'll get out and I deadhead them, keep the flowering going. I've got loads of geraniums out there that are just still flowering and flowering. I have got a massive glut of tumbler tomatoes. I will bring you some tumbler tomatoes.
I've got loads too.
Yeah, coming out my ears. So it's kind of it's all still going on, but the balcony is particularly important because as you know, I love to fill it with bulbs for next spring. I love to have that anticipation. So I'll be picking up the catalogues very shortly and thinking about what I want to put in.
I mean, I think it's quite a tricky month sometimes, isn't it? Because you can have a glorious Indian summer, but actually you might suddenly find it plummets and you've got that first frost. And when we're talking about the variation across the country, you know, we know that for listeners sort of a lot further north, the cold is starting to bite. And I guess that's one thing to be wary of, is any plants that you need to start thinking about protecting or bringing indoors.
Know that I remember when I worked up in Scotland, these are ornamental plants like Dixonia, like tree ferns and stuff. They would start Hessian wrapping them towards the end of September in anticipation of the cold weather coming in. In London, it's different. I can't remember the last time we had a cold September. In fact, it can be one of the sunniest months of the year. If the sun's out in September, I'm a happy man.
So one of the things that I'd like to sort of talk a bit more about is houseplants. And I had the privilege of editing a video that you did earlier in the summer where you talked about your houseplants. And I thought it was really interesting. I'm quite lucky that I've always lived somewhere with a garden. So for me, houseplants are very much decoration. I have them to make the house look nice, and because I can never choose pictures or ornaments. But one of the things you said was really interesting, that for you, the houseplants and that greenery is the therapy. And I think as we come into the sort of colder, perhaps darker months, it's something quite interesting to explore, is how you can keep that greenery going, particularly if you're living in a flat or in an urban area.
Well, as you know, they've become very trendy in recent years. And I think that's because we have two things really: a much bigger renting population, probably a bit more nomadic. And I know my relationship with houseplants began when I was very young, because I moved around a lot. We were never in one place. When I left home, I'd move around quite a lot, and they were my garden. In fact, I lived in a bedsit in Charlotte Street in Brighton. I had 200 houseplants in one bedsit, and I actually blew up 3 tellies, misting them down while I was there. And they were my garden. And I just think that my flat now is half flat, half forest in some parts of it, and I just think they just provide this incredible atmosphere to the home. You know, as soon as you're through the door, you just relax. You know, they definitely have a well-being effect on you, and it's not. I mean, if I go into someone's house and there's no houseplants, it almost looks bare to me, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to look at them that way, and not the way that I've previously looked at them, that just a bit of decoration. So what would you be doing? What would you be thinking about for your houseplants? You know, sort of September, end of September, as we're looking towards the colder months.
Well, it was interesting you say about them being ornaments, because that's quite. I think people buy them for that reason, and then they forget to water them and look after them, and then.
Oh yes.
So I'm not saying you do, but you know, I'll go into many a house and there's a dead cheese plant on top of the radiator, and they go, "What's wrong with my plant?" I mean, what do you think's wrong? We haven't watered it for 4 months. So people need to get through their head that it's a living creature in the house, like a garden, and they need to pay attention. The big rule, like as we come into the colder months, certainly is, and the radiator's bang on, is keep them away from heat sources, because they just won't enjoy that. You're out all day, it's quite cool in the flat, you come in, you whack the heating on, temperature goes right up, and they just transpire so heavily, and you get browning around the edge of the leaves. You'll just make them miserable like that. You really will. So keep them away from heat source. The other thing I think is quite important is, as the days get shorter, just reduce the watering. Through the summer, I water my houseplants really freely, even my cactus. But as I get towards the end of this month, I will start to reduce it. And actually, as we go into the dark months, winter, if I water my plants once every 3 weeks, that's quite generous. So think about it as daylight. The longer the days, the more frequency of the water, I think. The other thing I do is, and this is great fun, is I've got quite a lot that will divide. So houseplants are notoriously easy to propagate. So I have calathias and spathiphyllums. And what I'll do is I'll knock them out the pot, and I'll just separate them and pot them into separate pots. And they make quite a good crimbo presents.
Oh, I hope I get you in the Secret Santa. I could do with some more. You never have enough, do you?
No, you never. I could listen. If my wife, good lady wife, let me, there would be no room in here. It would be a jungle. It'd be back in that bed sit, I tell you. The other thing you can do as well is, you don't need to. People tend to buy a houseplant and have one plant in that houseplant. Well, you can mix it up a bit. These are all rainforest plants, so they'll grow in environments where there's actually not much soil. It's leaf-lidded, and they grow in layers. So, you know, a plot maybe where you can have a weeping fig as a main character. Then underneath that, some ground cover plants like spathiphyllum, you know, the peace lily, and then you can put some trailing trellis, some mixed plants together. Create your own little rainforest in a pot.
It's got such opportunity that I think we overlook. And like you say, they're quite easy to propagate, because they're notoriously difficult to get hold of organically, and particularly peat-free. But actually, if you just, with a bit of knowledge, learn how to propagate them, you've got loads coming to then swap with friends.
Lots of them will just go in water. You take a cutting off them, you know, and you put them in water. Lots of them will root. And you're right, it gets you round that, you know, feeding the peat industry, because a lot of them will be grown in peat in nursery conditions. And I know that's changing now and it's all positive, but if you wanted to be sure and pure organic, then that's a good way around it.
So one of the other things I think is important to do in September is to just take a bit of time to have a think about your successes and failures, look back, what's worked and what hasn't. So I'm keen, you're going to make me jealous. Tell me about your successes.
Well, yeah. So it's a really slow start to the year, because it was such a dry spring, wasn't it? So it's very hot and dry. So everything grew really, really slowly, quite slowly. But it's really taken off as the summer got going. It really took off, and I think my successes have been things like I've got so many courgettes and squashes, tomato. A lot of those sort of hot crops have done really well, and I tend to grow them through Mypex. Where the wheat ground's really weedy, I put Mypex down and I slip plant through, and I put a mulch round, and it almost creates like a little mini microclimate. And so they perform very, very well. Tons of potatoes and tons of onions. And I think one thing that's been really pleasing is I sowed a lot of hardy annuals calendulas, nasturtiums, these kind of plants straight into the ground in strips along the side of the beds. And so it's been incredibly colourful.
And then I think, I haven't enjoyed the same success as you this year, but I think that's probably due to our varying experience in growing. But one of the things we've really got on top of this year was our succession planting for lettuce.
Yeah.
Now, normally, I'm the worst for it. We get all excited in the springtime, we sow a load of seeds, and then suddenly you're inundated with flipping lettuce. You're giving it away because there's only so much you can eat. But this year, we really got on top of it. We sowed the mixed leaves, the cut and come again. And then what we did is gradually split them out into plants and actually sowed them in beds, and we sowed them in different beds. So in different places across the gardens. We kept some indoors and we kept some in the greenhouse. And that just meant we could keep that continual supply of lettuce. I'll admit we still did give quite a lot away. But succession planting is something that I think certainly I've struggled with. And I think a lot of beginners may find it the same, because you like to think springtime planting, get it all done, move on to the next job. Does it take the planning, or is it a case of just holding back and not doing everything at once?
I like to see the soil full, so it's a good filler, like you just described there. You can dot stuff around in borders and in raised beds. And so I would say with those kind of plants, you can look to sow every 2 or 3 weeks just to keep going. And if you think about it, you get a packet of seeds, lettuce and salad leaf, there's like hundreds of seeds in there, so you can be quite liberal with them. And I think that what maybe the mistake people make is they sow one crop and they go, oh, that was brilliant, and then you think it's over. I think that, you know, to keep going, to keep indulging yourself, and really, there's nothing like fresh salad leaves. You soon get used to having that fresh food on your plate, and it's no comparison with stuff that you buy out of a shop.
So go on then, what are your failures?
I've had a big trouble when it was hot early in the season with stuff bolting. So spinach, which is one of my favourite crops, that kept bolting in the heat, and that's partially because of the heat, but also I think a watering regime. I should have been tighter with my watering to stop that happening. So that's been a bit of a disappointment, really. I did. I had some potatoes go over a bit early as well. I didn't have as many as once, and I think again that's probably a watering issue. So yeah, not everything's been a result, I don't think, and I think I will put that partially down to it's been quite a freaky spring, a hot freaky spring.
I think that's it's interesting. The watering it's been our biggest challenge. We had this is our first year with a greenhouse. Really exciting, but I think we've been complacent with our watering. So we had some blossom end rot on our tomatoes, and we had aubergine, which they had spectacular flowers, but they just never set fruit. And I think I think it's easy to look out and see it chucking it down with rain and forgetting that your greenhouse is still as dry as ever.
Yeah. It's a discipline, isn't it? Remember, I always say the watering is the most crucial job, and you kind of need to just check it daily. Really, you need to get into that routine. It's quite typical if you get flower drop and no fruit forming. That is more than likely an irrigation issue. You need to keep that soil evenly moist, not too wet, just enough moisture in there, and they'll retain the flower and the fruit will form. It happens with a lot of plants.
So we can't talk about failures without talking about black fly. It's just been a nightmare for me. Has it been the same?
Absolutely. I when I took out my broad beans in June, there was so much black fly. They were even covered all the pods, and my hands were stained black for days. Yeah. And I really remember the ladybirds turning up, thinking, they'll sort this out. And no, you'd have needed a 1 foot by 1 foot ladybird to sort that out. So it has been. I think they just again really enjoyed that hot spring. It's been an exceptional year. I think that if I was going to do it next year, and I was worried it was going to happen again, I might look, and I only use this as a last resort, but you get organic deterrent sprays, and you start putting them on every couple of weeks as the plant grows, and they make the leaves taste bitter, and that should deter the black fly. But I'd kind of only do that if it was a last resort. I'm hoping this year was a bit of an unusual year.
What we've found, which is really interesting, is at Garden Organic, talking about it, there's the majority of people have had a real nightmare, but actually there are one or two who've been sort of come out of it pretty unscathed, and they're the real sort of horticulturalists that have been growing organically for kind of 20, 30 years in the same place. And I think that's quite interesting, because it's a real evidence that if you can get that balance right, you were talking about all the hardy annuals and things you planted in your borders, and again, I'm guilty of this, and I'm sure lots of beginner gardeners are. You compartmentalise your veg patch and your flower garden. Yeah. And actually doing what you've done and just trying to bring in a lot more plants that will feed those beneficial insects to just keep them coming in, and then hopefully you do stand a much better chance if we do have another year of black fly, which hopefully we won't.
Yes, hopefully.
They'll definitely be there, but
not in such numbers. But having that mosaic, I suppose you call it, that I think is the bedrock of organic gardening. Having lots of stuff mixed together, not too monocropped. And also, I just think that's my kind of gardening. I think it looks very beautiful. So don't be afraid to do it. And as time progresses, you'll get that balance in the garden, and those pests won't be so much of a problem.
So then the other thing that I think would be interesting to talk about is those people that have just started out. So we know this year has just been such a strange year, that in the springtime we're all in lockdown, and there was a huge surge in people taking up gardening for the first time, or looking to their outside space and seeing how they can really make the most of it. What would be your top tips for how they then maintain that throughout the year?
Well, I would definitely try and put some sort of skin in the game, if you like. So I think one of the things about being a gardener is we're all always anticipating what's coming up. We're always kind of 3 months ahead of ourselves in some ways. And so what I'll be doing on my balcony, which is what I recommend, is as my summer season comes to an end, I will be planning for a big burst of colour in the spring. So I've got something to look forward to. So I'll be putting my bulbs in. All my bulbs will go in. I will put in forget-me-nots and pansies and primroses and primulas. And so I'll have something going on out there that I know I can anticipate. So it kind of maintains my interest through the dark months. It's not just a dead space. You can also, you can still grow food this time of year. I'll put in spinach. You get like winter crops like Mizuma and oriental mustards and these sort of plants. So you can still graze away out there. The worst mistake you can do is what you've just described is, the days get shorter, you shut the door and you no longer take any interest in it, because we'll all be busy again probably next spring, and it'd be a shame to lose what is such an amazing pastime.
Yeah, I suppose it's any ways that you can remind yourself, I guess, because for everyone but the kind of die-hard gardeners, as the weather starts to turn, you just think, the last thing I want to do is go out into the garden. But it's, it's interesting what you say about putting those bulbs in. So you've got something to look forward to.
Yeah, so you've got that skin in the game. I think it's also important that, and this is for all fair weather gardeners, you miss a trick if you're not out there in the autumn and the winter, because they're actually beautiful seasons. And I think you kind of bond with gardening, during those days in a way. It becomes all, when you're quite close to nature and its changes is what make of the gardener. And I think it's a shame to miss out on that.
And I suppose, you sort of say to think about bulbs and what you can plant, and, you start to see the seed catalogues start to arrive over sort of September, October. And I find that a really exciting time. It's like the equivalent of when I was a kid and you got the Argos catalogue. You're folding down corners as you're thinking what you grew last year and what you'd like to grow. And it is that, like we say, it's that time to think about what you've really enjoyed this year and make sure you're putting yourself in a good position for next year.
That planning, that anticipation, you just hit it on the head there. Get your catalogues in, have a look, go and visit a botanic garden or a national trust property, go and get inspired, take the family along. If you've discovered gardening this summer, I tell you now, I implore you, don't let it go, because you'll just, it just brings you happiness, well-being. I can't say favourably enough about the fine art of gardening, and I know there's no bad in it at all.
And I guess that's the overarching message, isn't it? That you just give something a try, and we'll all have successes and failures. So if you have just started this year and something's not worked, you've had a crop that's been decimated by slugs, well, that's life. And
it's don't worry. Listen, wisdom is born from error, and that rule applies from gardening as well as life. And I think that do little things, grow some pea shoots on the windowsill, and then put a rose in on the garden, watch that flower next year, and just feel it out. And just make sure you're relaxing and enjoying it. There's no big hurry, no big rush. Take a breath, enjoy the garden.
That's fantastic. Wise words. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, cheers, Hannah.
Our interview this month is with a true world expert and garden organic ambassador, Caroline Holmes. Author, broadcaster, lecturer, garden designer, tour guide, I could go on and on. Caroline is a garden historian and is normally exceptionally busy travelling the world at this time of year, but because of lockdown has been grounded. She kindly spared some time to share with Chris her passion for gardening, in particular gardens through history and Monet's garden. Caroline also treats us to a virtual tour of her garden, which sounds absolutely beautiful.
Really pleased you could join us today, Caroline.
And I'm delighted to be invited.
So I'm going to start with the obvious question. Where does the passion come from? Where did you get that from?
Oh, goodness me. That's actually eating. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, yes, it is definitely eating and scent. So it's very much a sort of sensual thing with the gardens. And actually, I changed careers in my late 20s and retrained in horticulture and chose to go into herbs and specialised in herbs. And they absolutely encapsulate the eating, the scent, and history. I'm fascinated at the way people use plants. Funnily enough, we're having a family quiz tonight, and I'm going to show some wall paintings of plants that go back, to the 19th century BC. And I can say, who can say, what period this was? And that link with the pleasure and the enjoyment that is timeless in sort of the history of the human race, really.
So it's almost like it's dialectical, isn't it, in a way? It shows a strand from a long way back. I remember going, when I worked at Westminster Abbey, I worked there for a while, and that garden's 900 years old. So it's kind of this massive line of history, culture, food, art, everything. You think gardening is central, isn't it, to that?
Absolutely. And it doesn't matter the thought that we have changed as humans. You want to be dry, you want to be warm, and you want to be well fed. And if something tastes nice, then your life is enhanced.
Yeah, so it's almost like a key, a foundation stone, isn't it, to everything?
I think. Well, not that I'm biased, of course.
Me neither. How important is gardening to culture, do you think, in the UK?
I think very important. And I think it doesn't have to be complicated or sophisticated. And again, going back to herbs, I always say they're as good for the beginner gardener as they are for somebody who's gardened for years and years and years. And it's the enabling, you go back, I don't know, when I was young, you did your cress on a flannel or something like that.
Cress on an eggshell.
It is that with a child, and I haven't actually been into a school recently. So when I had my own children were humiliated, so they didn't want me to come in, but my nephews were thrilled if I came in. And I would take plants and I'd show how the roots were growing. And that fascination, children just love it, and they can watch something growing. And it's marvellous. And then if you can eat it as well, get back to food. But it is the sheer pleasure of plants and gardens and open spaces.
So if you're going to teach a child about art, so I know the Impressionist is one of your things, so if you can use a garden as a catalyst for that. So if you're teaching kids in a small space to grow a bit of food, then it leads on to other broader discussions or education.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a teacher, and so whether I'm sort of the right person to be saying this, but you've got it's colour. So when you've got small children, and it's the idea of identifying a colour. And then actually I have got one grandson, and his mother's very keen on him smelling things.
Yeah.
And he obviously can't verbalise what he's smelling, but because she's done it really early on, he sort of responds to nice smells. Again,
sure.
With sort of the herbs and things, yeah.
So in a way, I mean, I do a lot of stuff with kids, through my Blue Peter days and stuff, and I find them very interested in the fact that they respond to it very positively. There's no barrier, but it almost feels natural to them to garden. But if you were trying to teach them about art, where would you start in relation to the garden?
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I've noticed in schools, and first of all I thought, well, that seems a bit stupid. They copy famous artists. And then I realised actually it's not such a bad idea that in the style of, you are by default introducing them, shall we say, to the Impressionists by saying, here are Monet's water lilies, let's say. And the children copy them, and they're looking at the light on the water and the sky and everything else. And then actually thinking again I'd forgotten that. When our younger son was 4, I think he was, before he went to school, and they had the first of the big Monet exhibitions at the Royal Academy, and the only way I could go was if he came with me. And I did feel a weeny bit mean to take a 4-year-old to a Monet series paintings. And as we were going along, I just said to him in apology, I said, I'm afraid the paintings are a weeny bit similar. And this with all the knowledge of the world, he said, can't you see the way that the colours are changing in the different lights? And I thought, do you know what?
Yeah, he's getting it.
And I think that's it. I thought, actually, you'd think you need to do the Disney factor, and you do need to have fun. But children will surprise you.
I'm going to now, because I know one of your specialist things is the Monet garden.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just kind of ask a bit more about that, because you've written books about it and you lecture about it, and everybody kind of knows this garden, the war lilies and the changing of his eyesight during it. But do you plant-based that? How do you approach that? What is quite a big subject?
It is a big subject, and I have approached it from every single angle. Because, for example, last year they had a big water lily conference, which started in Paris, and then we went to Giverny, and then we went down to where the water lilies were bred at a place called Le Temple-sur-Lot. And there you had people who were absolutely passionate about water plants. As you quite rightly said, of course they knew who Monet was, but their knowledge of art was, that wasn't there. They were mostly American, and funnily enough, actually 5 from Wuhan, poor souls. And we had various other Chinese who come. So how do I approach it? Again, you try and pick up on where the interest lies. So obviously with them, the interest lay with how the pond looked, how the water lilies were growing. And I have to say, that's not my speciality at all, although I did a lot of research on them. Then I've taken art society groups there, and they're very keen to look at the motifs. And Giverny, from the point of view both of a gardener and an artist, the house sits with its back to the hills, and the hills are on the north side. Uh-huh. So it's a wonderfully protected site that has the full arc of the day's light from dawn to dusk falling on the garden. And one of the nice outcomes of the conference was I drove independently down to Le Temple-sur-Lot and stayed overnight in Giverny. And the gardener said to me, I start work at 7 a.m. Would you like to come in at 7 a.m.? Well, I was up that spring at 7 a.m. And I've never been, you see, and then you see the sun literally, it was August, end of August. Right. Watch the sun actually rising over the garden and beginning to catch all the tops. It was so exciting.
So really what inspired his paintings probably had at that time, isn't it? Because otherwise that's a very busy garden, isn't it? It must get a lot of footfall going through it. So you're well known for that. You've got this book written, and a few books. Is it a couple of books?
Yeah, I've done Monet at Giverny, Impressionists in their gardens, and actually with lockdown, I have a sort of 1 hour, and that's for Art Society's lecture, Impressionists in their Gardens, because so many artists came from around the world to Paris to study art that they then went back, and you've got American Impressionists and Australian Impressionists. And I call it Impressionists in their Gardens because all of them, if they didn't have gardens, used friends' gardens to paint. And you've got a wonderful international selection of paintings. And the Australians are particularly interested. 1888 was the centenary of settlement in Australia. And the artists particularly said, all this business of talking about painting nature and being at one with nature, in Australia, we are painting nature. We've only got to take a train and walk 5-10 miles, and we are in untouched country, up in the bush. And our Impressionist art, and they call themselves the Heidelberg School, should celebrate the drought, the harshness of our light. And there's a wonderful selection of Australian paintings, and a core of them that painted them with the zenith landscape as it's described. It's really interesting. And things like fruit trees, absolutely, hanging on in there because they're
in such an extreme environment.
Yes. They look much more Japanese actually than they look European
because they're stunted and by the environment. Yeah. So basically, right, that's interesting what you're saying. The Monet garden is a catalyst for all these other environments.
Except he never let them go in. I mean, that's what's really interesting. If you look at his paintings, he's the only one who painted there. And actually, they had American Impressionists who came and stayed in the village.
Really? So he never let them paint.
Didn't invite them in. No,
only Monet painted.
And so I was when I was doing the water lily book with the guy. I was chatting about this with the guy who owns the water lily nursery now, and we came to the conclusion that he suddenly realised he'd got, what is it they say, a USP. If he painted his garden and only he painted it, and the way he created his pond at the time was really cutting edge, because everybody had formal water pools which they planted their water lilies in. He had this sort of naturalistic pond.
So he was looking at what would have been a formal setting, he naturalised, basically. So we would take that for granted now.
Yeah, and the way he planted his flowers in the upper garden, well, if you look at the actual plan, it's very formal, but it's to make the most of the light and the sunlight. And the effect is totally sort of floriferous and informal.
I know, because obviously we all know this garden, the Monet garden, but it's great to hear it described in those terms. I'm going to bring you on to a little bit more onto horticulture now, in the sense that obviously you're a historian. What I'm curious about is, especially as not present day organic gardeners, is what still applies. I'm always quite interested. I trained on Brighton Parks, and the old boys there were big on composting, soil health, this kind of stuff. And I'm wondering that in this day and age of social media and flower shows, have we carried this knowledge forward, do you think?
Yes. What we lack, and I judge the local allotment, well, not this year, but we have 5 allotment sites in Bury St Edmunds, which is near me. I have often said, whereas in the past you learnt it because, you grew up with somebody who gardened, and that's how it was passed on.
Yeah.
And some of the allotment sites have a sort of, that's part of it. Somebody who's had an allotment for a long time will advise others, but not all of them do that. And I have sometimes been there when we're doing our judging, and you see people who are really struggling, who've never gardened before. The principles, and I wrote one of my other books is New Shoots, Old Tips.
Yeah, I saw that.
Gardening advice. There are so many things, and when you read them, and actually thinking about going back to the sort of Roman times, down in Cornwall there's a village called Chichester, which wasn't Romanized. It was just a little settlement, stone houses, and I was looking at the way they all had these sort of little terraced gardens by the house. And I realised that each one had positioned their little terraced garden so that it faced south. Now, what the Victorians did when they built their greenhouses and their great glass houses was that they would grow early salad crops by catching the sunlight early in the year, because obviously a plant needs to be warm and it needs its maximum amount of light. And I thought, my goodness me, in 100 AD, they were doing that. They knew.
Same thing.
Same thing.
Wow.
And I think that you look at things, and it's always worth looking at old tips, because you think, oh, yeah, I could. Some, and you say Victorians, they just wanted to keep the people occupied. The enthusiasm for double digging and all this really labour-intensive jobs is very much where you can't have the labour force sort of sitting on their forks and not doing enough. So there are elements where really it's just making work.
It's keeping people busy. Basically.
And keeping them busy, yes, absolutely.
But they did come up with some genius stuff in a way, like I suppose you think maybe like cavity wall heating for peaches and stuff like that. That's brilliant. Still applicable now, isn't it? Very much.
100%. And I've just been, doing a lecture on exactly that how we're starting in the late Georgian period, but the Victorian period, the varieties of fruit. And as you say, having the peach houses, and Joseph Paxton, hero of the hour, who creates the Crystal Palace in 1851, and then takes that macrocosm and thinks, right, actually, the way these greenhouses are put together can be condensed down into the smallest little piece of glass that people can have in their own back gardens.
I was going to ask about heritage varieties, because I know you grow some, and you touched on fruit there. Do you grow heritage varieties of fruit, or is it something else?
I'm interested by old varieties. So, yes, we have planted quite a lot of old varieties. And although just put an apricot in, which is really, I could do with it making a bit more effort. I've spoken to it. That's a new Morcott. It's a new variety. And it is through the Heritage Seed Library that I particularly like all their different beans, which I try and grow.
Right, but so you're right. It's going outside what I call the sphere of the F1. Those sort of bog standard plants that you can get from a garden centre. It's looking at it a little bit again, a bit of a broader horizon.
It's because if there's only 2 or 4 or 6 of you, you don't want everything coming right at the same time. Actually, we had a glut of chervil early in the year. Don't ask me how I managed to do it, but we looked like chervil. We ate it seeded itself everywhere, and I love it. So we just ate it in very large quantities.
I'm going to pick you up on herbs again because I know that's a big thing for you. We get a lot of people at Garden Organic who are new to it. Again, there's this kind of, I suppose, a disparity between those who've being brought up with it, but this new wave of people coming through. What advice would you give to someone if they wanted to just start a little herb garden and grow it and put it in their food?
There's an awful lot to be said. For example, rosemary and sage, brilliant in pots. If you think of them, they're rocky Mediterranean plants. Ideally, if you can get a terracotta pot, then you're off and you're away. And actually, rosemary and sage grow very well together if you've got a reasonable size terracotta pot. Then you need, what is easiest to grow is another element. And unfortunately, parsley is not the easiest to grow at all, although it's delicious. And I've said chervil, I've just mentioned it, is so
easy to do. Yeah.
It germinates brilliantly. It has a lovely, gentle aniseed flavour. My feeling with many herbs is if you've got space, go for perennials because you've then got them. And if you haven't got a lot of sun in your garden, if they're in pots, if you can find somewhere where they can go on holiday and
they'll still be alive when you get back.
Top up your tan. When I was thinking, no, they need to go on holiday. So they're in a shady spot.
They need that Mediterranean atmosphere.
They need a wee bit of sunshine. So if you take them off on their holidays. Now, I mean, Roman writer Pliny, for example, I'm going off from herbs, but he said the importance of holidays for vines. And he writes a whole section on that the vines should be allowed to go on holiday. And the way they go on holiday is that they are released from whatever framework you've tied them to, and you let them scramble. And he describes them rejoicing, on the ground.
Having that freedom, not being tied to wires and not back to a spur and all that sort of stuff.
And you go to somewhere like West Dean, and what do you see? They crank down all the vines off the wall or off the roof, and have them pointed down because all the auxins come to the top. So he was absolutely right.
I'm a big lover of composting, as most of us are at Garden Organic. And you've got one book titled The Little Book of Dung. I'm really curious about this. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about that.
The Not So Little Book of Dung.
The Not So Little Book of Dung. My mistake.
I'd love it to be republished, actually, because it's the Not So Little Book of Dung. It is dung in every possible form.
But with the dung, it's interesting with the dung because I remember being a parts apprentice and we used to have clover fields when we put something to lay. And then at the end of the 4 or 5 years, it's quite long stretches of time, a tractor would come along with a big load of horse manure on the back, tip up, and we'd be there with our pitchforks rolling around in it, to be honest with you. I've cleared the top of buses, Caroline, after a day like that. But I wonder whether the dung, you're thinking of using dung in those scenarios, that is a massive fertiliser resource that would occur in.
Actually, I mean, if you take guano, going right the way, again, Romans, we think of our pigeon houses and our dovecotes. They realised, let's go for Tudor times, one of the things about having a dovecote was that in the winter, because it's very light, you could transport it right to your furthest fields and give them a really good nitrogenous feed. And they knew that, because as you've said, if you've got huge loads of manure and you've got to do it with a cart, it's very hard work. But if you can transport pigeon dung, then you're absolutely away, because you really can get it much further out.
You put it in a hold all and carry it to where you're going, as opposed to needing a Ford tractor and a trailer. Yeah.
Anyway, and actually around the world, because we've got all I have to be very careful about saying about bat guano, and poor old bats are getting a very bad press.
Got bad press at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, but you look across the world, that bat guano has been used as well, highly prized. And then the ducks on moats, you see, moats would have been dug out probably every 10 years, and that lovely.
So you got that silt, that almost dung silt at the bottom of the
Right onto the ground. Brilliant.
So maybe just paint me a little picture of Caroline in her garden, if that's all right.
Caroline in her garden, the main structure, again, because of travelling, this will come as a surprise to you, lots and lots and lots and lots of herbs.
Brilliant.
Roses, fruit trees, and then this is going to sound terribly grand. We have what we call a hornbeam alley. We've got an acre, I should say, that goes right the way through the garden down to the polytunnel, and it's brilliant because you can't see the polytunnel because I put hazel between the polytunnel and the hornbeam arbor. So you have this formal, lovely, shady walk, and we have snow.
It's almost like an avenue. You paint a picture.
Yeah,
avenue of hornbeam. Yeah,
and it's not that. It's probably about 1.2 meters wide and maybe 10 meters long.
Wow!
But it absolutely, yes, it makes it. And those, because I travel a lot, those structures, the hornbeam alley, the fruit trees, the herbs, the roses, they'll do their bit whether I'm here or not. Then I tend to major on salad crops because I can put them in as and when.
Quite quick turnover, yeah.
I mean, that's a very simple picture. And then there's areas of grass. And the polytunnel this year has really been put to good use. I usually only use it in the winter when I'm here. But this summer I've been able to gone berserk with the tomatoes.
Brilliant. And you painted a brilliant picture. I've got a picture of you, maybe with a G&T out on the patio looking at this amazing garden.
You've read my blog about this. I can tell. Yeah.
Well, you know what? It's been an absolute pleasure. If I'd been with you one-to-one, we probably would have talked all day, I should imagine, quite easily. But I really appreciate it, Caroline, to chat to us. It's a lovely, lovely chat. I really, really enjoyed that.
It's now time to open the Garden Organic virtual postbag, and I've been joined by Anton and Chris to help with this month's questions, which have all been sent in by Garden Organic members. So the first question is about seed saving. So someone's written in and said they'd like to try seed saving from my peas and beans. I've left some on the plant, but I don't know when to bring them in. Will they get damp and mouldy? And is there anything that they need to look for when choosing which ones to save? Anton, is this something you have experience of?
Yeah, I mean, ideally you want to get them as dry as possible. So you actually want the pods to be at that sort of papery, crackly stage on the plant. And I realise that that's not always possible in the UK climate. That can be tricky. I mean, one way of getting around it is to harvest them sequentially. So sort of look for the dry ones and bring in the driest ones as you're harvesting them. If it really is getting towards sort of end of September, beginning of October, and they're not drying, you can dig out the whole plant and leave them to dry somewhere, perhaps hang them upside down in a dry space, because they're probably not going to dry that well outside after that time of year.
So Chris, is that something that you would do from your allotment?
Certainly. Well, it's interesting because all my peas now are, going over. They're sort of on their way out, but I'm not sure if I planned this right. I kind of quite casual about it, so I'll look at them and I'll then take some and I'll hang them upside down in the shed. I'll put a string up with a couple of drawing pins and hang them up there and wait for them to dry. But I should be planning it better. I think you should be looking out for the strongest plants, the healthiest sort of pods. I think I'd probably be interested to see what Anton thinks about. Maybe you should have a bit more structure to your seed saving and pick the plants a bit more specifically.
I think that's right. Often seed saving is a little bit of an afterthought. So what happens is people harvest and eat all the best ones and then sort of save seeds from the manky ones. And then you are actually sort of saving seeds which are probably not going to get the best chance in life when you go to sow them next year. I mean, you certainly should be looking for disease-free plants. You don't want any sort of fungal diseases on the seeds because they can be passed on. And particularly any viruses as well, any sort of plants with sort of strange mottled leaves. You don't want to be saving the seeds from those.
And once you've saved the peas and beans and you've got them dry, then what do you need to think about when it comes to storage?
There are two things really. It's dry and cool for storage. In fact, dry is the most important. That really is the thing to prolong the life of the seeds. Often people store things in sheds or greenhouses where the temperature and the humidity really sort of varies hugely. So although that seems a convenient place, it's not the best place to be storing them. If you've got a spare bedroom or something like that, it's probably a better place to be storing them. The other thing is just checking them out for any sort of pest damage. Sometimes you get weevils in there. You might not see them, but you see the evidence of their work. You see lots of little holes appearing in the seeds and little piles of dust. And best way of dealing with those, it sounds a little bit cruel, but is to put the beans in the freezer for a couple of days, and that will kill them off.
I tend to put mine in small Tupperware when they're fully dry. Is that a good idea, Anton?
Yeah, that will keep them dry. One way of really drying them out well is to store them with some rice, which you've actually dry the rice out in the oven first to get it really dry, and then you mix it with the beans, and that will help to keep the moisture out.
Oh, that's a good tip.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I think we've all seen this year with the rush and the panic that people had getting hold of vegetable seeds, that actually planning some seed saving into your growing is a really good organic growing technique.
We always save a few seeds. It's always a nice thing to do. It's sort of completing the whole life cycle as well. I find it a very satisfying thing to do.
Brilliant. Okay. So we'll move on to the second question. And this has come from someone who's only recently started gardening. So they've written and said that they've heard they should avoid bare soil. As their veg patch starts to empty, what would we recommend covering it with? And I suppose the place to start here is whether that's the case. So should we be avoiding having bare soil? And if so, why? Anton, is that something you can enlighten us on?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, bare soil is probably the worst thing you can be leaving over the winter, especially with our sort of really heavy rains that we're having. It just washes a lot of those hard-earned nutrients out of the soil, and so the plants can't get at them next year. The worst thing you can do is actually digging the soil over, because what that does is it stirs up quite a bit of the organic matter, and it releases nutrients from a sort of bound up form into a more sort of soluble form that will get washed out even more easily. So really you want to avoid doing that sort of digging stuff over, even if it looks tidy. So yeah, bare soil is definitely not what you want to be leaving over the winter. So the ideal thing you want to be doing is growing a green manure to take up those nutrients. So something like vetch, field beans or grazing rye are very good ones to grow over the winter. And there's more detail on our website on how to do that, on how to grow green manures and pick the best one for growing over the winter. I appreciate that that's not always easy for everybody to do, because you do need to get your green manures in by September, and perhaps people are still harvesting things at that stage. So the alternative is perhaps to cover your soil with a mulch. So Chris, have you got any sort of experience of using mulches?
Yeah, I do, Anton. I have as you know, quite a pernicious weed problem on my allotment because it was not touched for 6 years. So I'm constantly fighting that. And the bottom end of it particularly, I have a lot of bindweed and cooch. So I think that's probably a good case for me, trying to suppress those weeds over the winter and also do some benefit to the soil. So I will order in. I've got a guy who'll deliver me half a trailer load of rotted manure, and I'll put that down and maybe put a bit of cardboard over the top of that and then seal it all in with my pegs and tent pegs and leave that for the winter to protect that soil and hopefully improve the soil structure and make pulling out any weeds come the spring. Those sort of long stringy bindweed roots will come up a much easier if that soil's nice and friable. I'm also a big advocate of, I try and keep as much of the allotment planted as I can, to be honest with you. This time of year, all my broad beans are going to go in, so I'll probably start them in root trainers, to be honest with you, in the flat, and then I'll plant them out nice and thick into some of my beds, and they'll kind of sit there through the winter for an early crop next early summer. And I quite like to see greenery. I know you're the same. I don't like to see bare spaces. I need to plant. I'm quite happy to leave. I've got leeks in. They'll sit there. Brussels sprouts, cabbage, they'll sit there to the winter that I've already put in. And I'll also have one little last bash at filling stuff out with the cooler sort of quick crops, salad crops. And so I'll try and keep it as active as I can.
That sounds very sensible to me. If you can be growing produce on it, that sounds one of the best options.
I think it's also important if I put down any sort of mulch, make sure it's well rotted. I mean, compost, if I've got compost, but I want to use that, I want to utilise that. It's like black gold, isn't it? I want to be much more specific with that compost, to be honest with you. But some people put down straw, but just be a bit aware that if you put something down that's quite neat and fresh, it will take the nitrogen out of the soil. The microbacteria that break it down will use nitrogen, and you can end up depleting the soil a little bit. So the more rotted the mulch you put down, the better, really.
And I know another common thing people use as a sort of cover or a mulch is carpet. Is that something you'd recommend?
I would say carpet is not a good idea for a number of reasons. Often it's quite heavily impregnated with chemicals like dyes and also insecticides as well. And often it's got a lot of sort of synthetic fibres in there, which as some of the carpet breaks down, it will start releasing microfibres into the soil. So generally we wouldn't recommend carpets.
So growing some green manures is your first choice, or mulching or covering with something, or you continuing to grow some crops. Is there any other options?
One option is if your plot is not too weedy, you could just leave it alone, because some weeds like chickweed would actually act as a green manure in themselves. Chickweed isn't too much of a problem, and it will help to just protect that soil structure, and you could then cut it down and dig it in the spring.
It's almost better to have some sort of vegetation than nothing at all, really, I think, because it just like Anton said, the nutrients will leach through, and you'll have a poorer soil come the next growing season.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. So our last question is a composting one. So this person's written in and said they've got hundreds of woodlice in their compost heap. Are they good to have in the garden, or are they something we need to be a bit more wary of? Chris, what do you reckon?
It's funny because as a gardener all these decades, really, they've always been around woodlice. I've never really paid them that much attention. They've always seemed incredibly harmless to me. We actually call them brickbats because I'm from a family of Brummies originally, even though you wouldn't believe it with this accent. And I always remember as a gardener you'd always find them under pots or under bricks, or as a kid I remember finding them in those sort of places. But they've always seemed harmless to me, so I know they eat decaying vegetation, so to me they always seem harmless and probably beneficial.
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I mean, woodlice like eating decaying matter generally, so they're basically doing a lot of good in your compost. They're helping to break stuff down. I mean, I think this goes with the bigger picture that people are often a bit horrified to find a load of things wriggling inside their compost bin, but most of it's doing a lot of good. I almost think of it as a bit like a sort of zoo inside my compost bin. There's all sorts of things in there.
That's a brilliant way to describe it. I love that. Because you do get so much stuff going on. I have slow worms in mine. I was going to turn it over and learn from more natural gardeners not to go sticking a fork into it in case there's something in there. And I lifted it up. There's quite a lot of cardboard in there at the top bit. And I lifted it up and there's like a 12 group of slow worm, little baby ones, all wound together. So you do find the most amazing things in a compost bin.
I must admit I'm the same. I don't like sticking a fork in my compost anymore. Our compost bin is just like a wormery. It is so full of brandling worms, which are helping to break the stuff down. But I know that if I'm going to stick a fork in there, I'm going to be spearing loads of worms. So I just use my hands and some gloves and get in there and
to me, mate, it's a great excuse to just get covered in muck, mate. I'll tell you, the more covered in muck I am when I get back home after the allotment, the better in my book.
So are there any things that we should be wary of in the compost heap?
I mean, if you've got a lot of fruit flies in there, it's a sign that it's perhaps a bit on the damp side. So you might want to be adding a bit more sort of dry matter like cardboard or wood shavings. On the other side, if you've got lots of ants in there, although they're helping to break stuff down, then that is generally a sign your compost is a bit on the dry side. So you might be wanting to add more sort of vegetable peelings or grass clippings.
So that sort of mixture of green materials and brown materials is quite fundamental for a balanced compost heap.
It is.
That's useful that the creatures can often be a bit of an early indicator if you've not quite got that balance right.
But now I'm sold on woodlice.
They need a rebrand as a brickbat.
Yeah, they do. We've been taking our brickbats for granted. That's what I say.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks ever so much, both. That's really useful, and we'll see you again next month. Well, we've reached the end of this month's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I would thoroughly recommend looking into Caroline's work and perhaps attending one of her talks or visiting Monet's garden at Giverny as soon as circumstances allow. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do take a minute to like, rate and subscribe so we can help reach as many people as possible and encourage them to grow the organic way. Our thanks again to the Organic Gardening Catalogue for sponsoring this podcast and to Kevin MacLeod for the music.